There's another thing that humpbacks do, which is a little harder to see, and it tells us a lot more about these creatures. I'm going to have Craig Matkin explain it. Craig is a research biologist based out of Alaska. His focus is generally on killer whales, but he knows a thing or two about humpbacks.
As killer whale biologists, we always make fun of humpbacks a little bit. They're so big and bulky, and they do everything so slowly, and they just open their mouths and graze, and it's like, well, it's not quite like that. Bubble net feeding is one of those things that shows you just how complex humpback whales are, because what it takes is a group of humpback whales that get together, 6, 8, or even more, and learn how to work together to corral prey. One animal, usually the lead animal, goes down and starts blowing bubbles and making these calls. They're hard to listen to because they're so intense, and they pull the fish into a ball too, so they can bring this bubble tighter and tighter, and then other whales will bubble, and you get this whole net of bubbles, plus these vocalizations go on and on as the whales work the fish up to the surface in the middle of this net that's formed by the bubbles, making these calls that make the fish just want to hug each other,
Bubbles produce noise, reflect light, and disturb the water. In other words, they confuse and they trap the fish, which obviously makes it easier for the whales to go in and feed. So the whales surround the fish with bubbles, singing louder and louder, confusing the fish and trapping them in their net. And then, when everything is just right, the leader makes a new call, and all the whales come rocketing up from the depths, mouths open, just swallowing up all the fish they've corralled together.
In this bubble net feeding, every animal has a position they're playing. Everybody is down there either bubbling or vocalizing, and it's a team effort. It's a very well choreographed team effort. In fact, it's hard to imagine how they choreograph this thing the way they do. The interesting thing is, in our area, they didn't used to do this until about 10 years ago. And suddenly we started seeing this bubble net type feeding where we were.
Did you catch that? They didn't used to do this in Craig's area, but now they do. So Craig got curious. He took some photos and he sent them to his humpback researcher friends. And they said, yeah, we know some of those whales. Those are our bubble netters. They had come to Craig's part of Alaska and taught the local population how to catch fish this way. To me, that is wild. We tend to think of animals naturally learning new behaviors slowly over many generations, not by some of them taking a trip and making some new buddies and teaching them this cool trick from back home. But here's the thing about humpbacks. The more we learn about them, the less surprising this story is. Take, for example, their song. Every year in the fall, Alaskan humpbacks start singing.
They start this song in the fall on the Alaska feeding grounds, and then all during this winter period, they're changing it. Somebody comes up with a lick and everybody goes, oh wow, that's cool. Or the females go, we like that one. And then all of a sudden the other males go, oh, I'm gonna work that one in. It's like a daisy chain, it's wild.
So they teach each other a song, then they improvise on it, they kind of jam a little bit, and then pretty soon, all the humpbacks are singing the same song. But in the summer, they stop singing. But in the fall, they pick up exactly where they left off. The same tune with the same variation, slowly evolving and changing until the next summer when it all starts again. And these are not simple melodies. They're sometimes 20 minutes long, and they repeat them over and over again. Whale songs are a complete mystery to us. We don't really know why they sing. Some people believe that it's to woo females. Others think that it's a sort of tonal map. Like, if a whale learns the way the locals sing in each part of the ocean, then he can kind of predict where he is on the planet. Or maybe they're just singing. Same reason any of us would sing, to look cool, to have fun, or to pass the time. But one way we're unlocking this mystery is by looking in unusual places for answers. Remember the researcher who heard that first recording I told you about? Well, her name was Katie Payne. And she and her husband studied whales and other animals. And this is what Katie said about that first recording to NPR. back in 2015.
We had no idea we were going to hear anything. He said, I don't suppose you've ever heard the sounds of these animals.
And then he played the song of the Humpback Whale.
I had never heard anything like it. Oh my God. Tears flowed from our cheeks. You know, we were just completely transfixed and amazed because the sounds are so beautiful, so powerful, so variable.
Katie had a degree in music as well as biology, so she turned to her music education for some insight into what she was hearing. She wanted to see if there were patterns in the whale recordings, just like there are patterns in music. So she got a tool called a spectrogram, and she found what looked like melodies and rhythms, pieces that repeated over and over again, phrases of music. So in other words, it wasn't just random noise, it was kind of like music, and actually, when she compared it to other forms of music on the spectrogram, it looked a bit like jazz. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds ridiculous. That's what the majority of the scientific community thought too. Whales aren't singing, animals don't talk, they just make noise, right? But the scientific community came around pretty quick because she was right. And her findings have become a fundamental part of how we think about these creatures. And this idea that humpback whales were singing to us was so exciting that it kind of even became pop culture. Yeah, this is Katie's then husband's record of whale songs. She released it in the 70s and it even broke into the Billboard Top 200. Can you imagine that? You go to the record store and pick up some Led Zeppelin, The Who, ABBA, some whale songs. I think that's the most 70s thing I've ever heard, but what's even more amazing than that is that humpback whale songs have gone where no one has ever gone before. Seriously. Somewhere out there is a NASA probe called the Voyager, and in it is a golden record containing the sounds of life on Earth in case an alien intelligence ever finds the probe and apparently has a record player, I guess. The golden record contains greetings in 55 different languages, from ancient ones to modern Chinese, and it contains whale song. The Voyager probe just left our solar system and it's now more than 14 billion miles away from the sun. Think about how amazing that is for a second. If an alien intelligence is out there in the cosmos and finds this probe, they'll hear the song of the species that we here on Earth are still trying to understand. Of all of Alaska's whales, the orca, or the killer whale, is one of the most striking and recognizable. They're black with distinctive white spots, and they weigh up to 6 tons and span 23 to 32 feet. Whether you call them killer whales or prefer their Latin name, Orquinus orca, orca for short, you can't deny how magnetic they seem to be.
I didn't really intend to do killer whale work. I intended to go to Alaska and I worked as a fisheries biologist, which is what I started doing. The whales found me, you know. I was in a kayak in a lagoon in Prince William Sound where killer whales just don't go. And I had killer whales come charging in and I couldn't believe it. They all just came right around the kayak and started just swimming really slowly and just hanging around in the water and where I could be eye to eye with them. And it went on for maybe a couple hours. I didn't know what was going on at the time. It's what I call now group resting. They just rested and hung out with me there for 2 hours or so. It was amazing. And you know, I wasn't really afraid. I just was completely consumed by them. I wasn't thinking about everything that was going on. There was just something that pulled me right into being there with them. And so it changed everything.
Orcas are found all over the world, but there's actually 2 different types of killer whales. There are the residents and the transients, and they look almost identical. The males of both types have triangular dorsal fins, while the females have this sort of curved sickle-shaped fin that you can easily spot when you're whale watching. But despite the similarities between the transient whales and the resident whales, well, they're very different.
They've been separate for thousands of years, perhaps 10,000 years or more, and they just act like different species. But they look the same to the untrained eye. Well, the transients are stockier and have more pointy fins, and they dive in a different manner, and they do longer dives usually. They're very stealthy, they don't talk much.
And there's a good reason for this. The transients and the residents actually eat different things. The residents eat fish, while the transients eat marine mammals like seals and sea lions and porpoises. So they have to hunt in very different ways.
It's a very noisy. Fish aren't bothered by the noise. They're spread out, all using echolocation, bouncing sound out to locate fish and communicating with each other about what they're seeing here, what they're seeing there. And then they get in close, and you hear the echolocation changes. It gets very quick and high-pitched. And then it stops, and that's usually where they're using eyesight now to chase a fish. The transients have to be really quiet. They have to use stealth. If transients echolocated on seals gone, but the fish don't respond to this. So transients tend to travel these long distances up to 1,500 miles. Residents travel shorter distances, maybe 300 to 600 miles, but that's still, they don't sit in one place. None of them sit in one place. But residents do tend to be concentrated along shoreline, a few hundred or more miles long, and transients will cover a whole ocean base. But they do come back to the same places again and again. They have hot spots that they prefer, that they come back to.
So let's talk about how scientists organize these whales. First comes the community. There's the southern resident and the northern resident, and then there are the transients. Each community is broken into pods, groups of whales that tend to live and hunt near each other. The pods are given letter names based on the order in which they were discovered. In Alaska, they're prefaced with the letter A for Alaska. So the northern residents are generally known as AA pod, AB pod, and so on. Within the southern resident population, they are known as J pod, K pod, and L pod. And then the transients, because of how vast their territory is, they're given a series of different name prefixes. Generally, they're given a T for transient, as in T1, T2, etc. And in Alaska, some researchers add an AT for Alaskan transient, so it all becomes a bit confusing and overwhelming. For our stories today, you just need to know we are talking about the AT1 transients and the J, K, and L pods of the southern residents. But the pod isn't even the smallest category. Killer whales are matrilineal. They follow the mother's line. And scientists have observed that mature orcas stay with their mothers long after they've bred and grown up.
Oh, the family bonds with these animals are just as tight as ours. The offspring with regular fish-eating killer whales stay with the mother forever. The males wander off when there are other pods around to mate with those females. They're back to mom, and in the end, they're with mom. And mom's feeding them even when they're big adults.
I think we all know a guy like that, right? Stayed with mom for way too long. But anyway, these different populations not only have different behaviors, they also have very different issues that they're facing. The transient population, remember, these are the ones that eat marine mammals. Well, there was a huge push to protect the harbor seal, which is their main food source. So as a result, they're doing well for the most part.
Transients in our area, there are two populations. One, we call the Gulf of Alaska transients. They're stable. And then we have this AT1 or Chukach transients, which my wife specialized in working on, and they're going extinct. They lost a bunch of animals after the oil spill. And it's a unique population. It's not just a pod. It's unique genetically, acoustically. There's nothing like these whales. Nothing like these whales. And there are only 7 of them left, and they will probably blip out in the next decade or two. We don't know all the reasons. The oil spill was the nail in the coffin, but there were problems before that. The harbor seals had declined dramatically. We don't know all the reasons that they're going extinct, but there was the oil spill nail in the coffin thing.
The Exxon Valdez spilled 10.8 million gallons of oil more than 30 years ago, and the Orca are still feeling the effect. On the other hand, the fish-eating northern residents are doing great. They live mostly in the quiet waters off northern Vancouver Island and southeast Alaska. The water is clean, there's abundant fish for them to eat, and their population has been going up for the past 40 years. But if you go just a few miles south, the southern residents live primarily in the waters off British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon, but they have to share the water with the more than 6 million people who live nearby.
Down there, they've been declining, certainly over the last 10 years, dramatically, and their body condition has been going down. There are only 76, I believe, of them left. It's a serious problem. They could be headed toward extinction. Many scientists think they are.
In the late 1990s, there were nearly 100 southern residents. Today, there's only 73. As far as anyone can tell, the main issue is food. The southern residents live mostly off of Chinook salmon, and because of increased damming and loss of habitat, well, the Chinook salmon are going away.
They're starving to death, and the pregnancy rate, they're seeing pregnancies and then the calves don't show up. They're aborting or they're dying really early. Well, there was a calf that died not long after birth, not too long after birth. This southern resident, this endangered female killer whale in Puget Sound, pushed around this dead youngster for 17 days over 1,000 miles.
You might have seen the headlines a couple of years ago. At the time, the baby girl was the first known calf to be born to the southern residents since 2015. She died less than an hour after she was born. Her mother grieved and grieved and grieved. She carried the 400-pound body 60 to 70 miles a day. It was a devastating display of grief. Researchers were heartbroken by it, and so was much of the world.
Other animals come in when there's a dead calf, and they may spend hours and hours, all of them together, just pushing the calf around, giving each a chance to be in touch with it, and and obviously involved in what appears to be the mourning process. Only the killer whales know why it was such an extreme grieving experience. But everyone's grieving experience is different. You can't explain grieving in humans. They used to put it in boxes. I've been there, and you can't explain it, and it comes and goes, but it's an incredibly strong force. And guess what? They feel it too. My wife died a couple of years ago, and she and I were partners for 31 years, and after the first 2 years of being so pissed off she wasn't out there with me, after a while, you realize these guys are like family, My being out here, being with these animals and keeping it going, it keeps her going. These animals are feeling the same things we are, and it's not just about grieving calves. And we should understand that what we do has an effect on what their lives will be.
What we do has an effect on what their lives will be. Sort of put that in the room to think about it for a moment. What we do has an effect on what their lives will be. Humans dam the rivers, which lessen the Chinook population. If we kill off the phytoplankton, then the krill have nothing to eat. If the krill have nothing to eat, then the Chinook starve, and orcas need to eat 30 Chinook salmon a day just to survive. It's all connected. Take, for example, the blob, a mass of warm water in the Pacific that's just empty of nutrients. Well, remember that upwelling we talked about? Well, if that process stops, then there is no food for anything.
What happened during the blob is ocean circulation stopped, temperatures went up, this high pressure area wouldn't go away, and basically the Gulf of Alaska became stagnant. If we start having conditions like that repeatedly, the salmon are going to suffer because the feed fish suffer immediately, and salmon have to have these feed fish. So do seals or the transient killer whales. So there's going to be these long-term effects with these whales, and that's the scariest thing. This was sort of a perfect storm situation, but we can have variations of this in the future, and it wouldn't surprise me. This is something nobody had ever seen before. These are temperatures degrees above what had ever been recorded over the last, 50, 75 years. And we all know that there's anthropogenic reasons for this happening. All the pathways are not clear, but it's clear that temperatures are going up and weather is becoming much more erratic. So that's a very frightening aspect of the future. By watching killer whales and their health, you can see the overall trends in the health of the waters.
But whales aren't just canaries in the coal mine.
The function of a predator, in part, is to maintain the health of its prey, as much as that sounds a little counterintuitive. But if they aren't putting pressure on the prey to stay at the top of their game, so in that sense, they also maintain the health of the ecosystem.
And new threats to the orca population continue to pop up all the time. It's not great. So, that is a lot of bad news, but there are reasons to be hopeful. People are fighting against the pollution of the Northwest waters, and we're taking care of the salmon population that feeds the killer whales.
Salmon's important to all of us, and fishing regulations, as hard as they are to want to impose on people, that's happening, and it's a tough thing to have happen. And whether it's too little, too late for there, we don't know. But in Alaska, we're going to make darn sure it's not too late.
And so far, the regulations and protections are starting to work. In March of this year, a new calf was born to the southern residents. Now, around 40% of all calves don't survive the first few years, but the baby orca appears to be healthy so far. And back in the fall of 2020, Tuluqua, the orca that mourned her lost calf, well, she had a new baby, an orca named Phoenix, who's doing just fine. And we can always learn from the amazing recovery of humpbacks. Humpbacks were hunted to near extinction. Some populations were reduced by more than 95%. But now they're flourishing. On average, 50% of female humpbacks are pregnant in any given year. And for better or worse, the warming of the Arctic waters has temporarily increased the humpback's food supply, the krill. But in many ways, the most inspiring thing about the humpback's recovery is actually kind of a metaphor for the way they hunt. Remember what we said about bubble net feeding, how it's a group of whales working together in a variety of ways to accomplish a single task?
This bubble net feeding, every animal has a position they're playing. It's a team effort. It's a very well choreographed team effort.
Well, there's been a global effort from private citizens, nonprofits, federal governments, and the general public to work together to protect the humpback. That's where I'm going to leave you today, with a final story about a time when we as a group of people did something amazing for these majestic creatures. It all starts on October 7th, 1988. Roy Amagok, an Inupiaq hunter, discovered 3 gray whales trapped in ice near Point Barrow, Alaska. Now, whales like us breathe air, and the whales that were stuck in the ice were unable to leave a little hole that they had without drowning. Roy tried to cut a path in the ice to open water, but it didn't work. Local villagers stepped in to help. They worked through the night using chainsaws to cut holes in the ice for the whales to breathe. The town didn't actually have a lot of chainsaws, but a company heard about the whales and sent some to help. In fact, word got out and soon the media was paying attention. The whales were given Inuit names, Pitu, Siku, and Kanek, and English names, Bonnet, Crossbeak, and Bone. Everyone was excited to see them reach safety, and as more and more people chipped in to help, the whales looked like they'd make it. But then, a new problem arose. An ice ridge had built up against the shore, and it was far too thick for a chainsaw. The whales were stuck. But by then, Bonnet, Crossbeak, and Bone had some fans in pretty high places. The US government, who turned to the Russians. And when we were still stuck in the Cold War, it turns out that whales are pretty good PR. And the Russians sent 2 icebreakers. And on October 27th, 20 days after the whales were first spotted, they were finally free. The world celebrated. Now, we don't know what happened to those whales. After everything they had been through, scientists didn't want to tag them and cause them even more stress. But what is clear is that people loved those whales. And that love required an incredible amount of cooperation. Inupiaq hunters, biologists, oil companies, the Alaska National Guard, Greenpeace, the U.S. Department of State, the USSR, and more. An unlikely group worked together to free those 3 whales. And for me, that means that hope is alive for the whales. Today, there are countless ways to help. There are dozens of organizations all across the United States that are counting whales, tracking whales, advocating for, and researching whales. You can even download an app on your phone that will teach you how to identify an orca that you see and will help researchers track the movements of these creatures. Recently, a dead whale washed up on shore with 48 pounds of plastic in her digestive tract. But Operation Breakthrough and all of these developments show us what we are capable of, that we can put aside cultural differences and political conflicts and competing interests, that we can change our perceptions and our behaviors, that we can come together to better share and care for our planet and for these mysterious and beautiful giants of the deep. Thank you.